We just saw a video of my next guest in the book corner in the studio. Our next guest is Karen Linkletter. She's Director of Management at the Liberal Art Research Institute. And she leads a team of people, of researchers, who are dedicated to continue to promote the ideas of Peter Drucker and to also promote effective and also ethical leadership. Karen also recently wrote a book, which is standing right in front of us, and we will also talk about that in a bit. But first of all, Karen, how are you today, and how has your experience at the forum been so far?
Thank you. It's so great to be here. It's been just a wonderful experience of networking with people and sharing Drucker's ideas, and there's so many people who are familiar with Drucker and some people who know much more than I do, and it's just really nice to connect with everyone here in Vienna.
It's super nice to hear, and I believe you were also on a panel, as we just saw. What were your main insights from the panel that you can share with our audience online?
It was a great panel with Timo Meinhardt and Peter Paschuk. So Peter was a longtime friend of Peter Drucker's, a personal friend for about 20 years, and Timo is a Drucker scholar I've known for quite a while. We've collaborated on some things. And the panel's point was actually a question that Doris had asked Jenny Daroque, who was our chair, and did Peter get it right about the knowledge worker? And so we had, it was a bit of a debate, but I'd say a friendly debate about whether Peter got it right, and I think we pretty much agreed he did.
He did get it right.
Yeah.
What did he get right about the knowledge worker?
I think a lot of the things that he got right had to do with things that we're seeing about knowledge work right now. So one of the things that Drucker talked about was the portability of knowledge work. So now that the knowledge worker owns the means of production, if you will. So before, in traditional labor capital modes, people who were factory workers, when they finished their work, they left the factory behind and they went home. When you're a knowledge worker, you take your knowledge with you. So you can basically, as we've learned, you can work from home, you can work from Vienna and connect back home, if in my case in the United States. It really doesn't matter where your location is. And that gives the knowledge worker a lot of power, and Drucker talked about this. But the one thing that he did say was that knowledge workers still needed to have an organization to have some kind of connection. And as we've been talking in a lot of the panels here today, that is being challenged with particularly after the pandemic, with the role of remote work. And so one of the challenges we're facing with knowledge work is how do we align knowledge workers with organizational vision and mission, because knowledge work is so portable now.
You keep bringing up these great points, so I have to dive into them. So how can we align knowledge workers with the organization's mission?
I think we need to think about what motivates people. And we had a great talk in the panel about this of so hybrid work versus in-office work, and this big, this debate and clash. And Amy Edmondson talked about this in the plenary session at the beginning of we need to stop framing this as a battle. And she's right. We need to think of this, how can this be a win-win? How do we think about how people perform best? And Drucker said to know yourself. Managing oneself means you need to know how you work best. And he always worked alone. If you called him, he picked up the phone himself. He never had a secretary. And he knew that about himself, and he always worked alone as a consultant. He never worked for a consulting firm. Other people work better in an organization. So I think organizations and knowledge workers need to be flexible and understand each other as human beings and find a win-win both for the organization and for the worker.
You just wrote a new book called Peter Drucker and Management, which is standing in front of me on the table. And during the chat before the interview, someone also whispered to me that you knew Peter Drucker personally. From what I understand from this book, it's a bit different than other books about Peter Drucker, because your aim is to also highlight the person behind the book, behind all of those thoughts, and make him a little bit more tangible. We also had an interesting speech at the gala dinner yesterday by Richard Coquette, and he kind of said that Peter Drucker was, yes, he was a management theorist, but he was also a philosopher, and he was highly political. And he came from a very highly political background in Vienna at that time. Can you elaborate a little bit more about who Peter Drucker was and what are the thoughts that kind of influenced his own school of thought?
Absolutely. That's what really drew me to I've been writing about Peter for 20 years now. I met him when I got my MBA, and I went to the Claremont Graduate School at the time, and he was still teaching, and he was doing a graduate seminar, and he would do these 3-hour-long classes where you would just sit and listen to him talk, and he was just absolutely fascinating. And then I went to work for a while and then went back to get my PhD, and I did my PhD work at Claremont, and I decided I would write about Peter Drucker, doing a PhD in history. But I wanted to look at Drucker not as a management person. I wanted to look at him from this perspective of his European background and his philosophical and intellectual influences. And at the time, very few people understood him that way. They just thought of him as this management guy. And he was still alive at the time. It was towards the end of his life in the early 2000s, and I got to spend some time interviewing him. And then I spent a lot of time researching, finding other people who knew him and talking to them and reading what they'd written. And Drucker was living in Vienna was born in Vienna and living in Austria in this time in the early 1900s. He was born in 1909. When it was politically charged, there was this heavy socialist progressive movement. He was raised in this household with very, very educated parents. His mother studied medicine, which was unusual for the time. And they had all of these luminary intellectual figures that would just come to the house in this salon. And there was a house next door that was also a salon where musicians would arrive. And Peter was, as a young boy, exposed to just listening to all these conversations. And this was part of his intellectual influence that really followed him through the rest of his life, where he absorbed so many different disciplines: music, literature, philosophy, law, history. He read and studied everything and eventually went on to get a law degree. So he only ends up as a management person by accident of circumstances when he eventually leaves Nazi Germany and goes to the United States in the late 30s, and happens to come to the United States at the time when, after the World War II, there's this massive industrial expansion, and he sees capitalism as the solution to a functioning society.
You must have also done a lot of research, obviously, on Peter Drucker. What's one thing that you can share with our viewers that surprised you when you did the research?
I think the most surprising thing was the degree to which his ideas are still really relevant. He lived through so much turmoil. He lived through 2 world wars. He lived through the rise of not just National Socialism, but totalitarianism and communism. He lived through the Great Depression and the Cold War in the United States. So massive turmoil and volatility. And so his entire project was to balance this idea of continuity and change so that we could have a functioning society that wouldn't turn to demagogues or dictators, but that would be a free society of institutions where people could find status and function. And I think of that, and I think of today. And here we are. We've been through a pandemic. We've got the turmoil of AI that everybody's talking about here. We have political turmoil. I come from the United States. We just had an election that shocked everybody. We have war. With climate change, we have all of these things, particularly that young people need to be worried about. And here's Peter Drucker offering us a philosophy and an idea, a way of thinking that gives us hope.
It also sounds like the world he lived in was also struck by polycrisis like ours is.
Exactly.
So I think one of the main takeaways from your book, from what I understand, is that Drucker is more relevant than ever now.
Yes, and the things he has to say about knowledge work and about the role of government and taking care of the common good and the way society needs to function so that we all have meaning is still very relevant today.
You also wrote one chapter specifically on knowledge work in the book, which relates back to the conferences here, the forums here this year. One thing you talked about was that Peter Drucker wrote about the educational divide in a knowledge society, with an elite minority ruling an uneducated majority, which leads to polarization and social problems. And polarization, I think, is one of the buzzwords nowadays.
Right.
Can you tell us more about that, and how can the thoughts of Drucker help us mitigate this divide nowadays?
It's a good question. Drucker saw this divide between this growing knowledge group of knowledge workers that were educated and would need to continue to be educated to stay relevant, and then a group of people who were in a way left behind because they could not stay educated and relevant, or wouldn't continue to follow continuous learning. And he was very concerned about this because he said, on one level, we have a stratification of society which elevates the knowledge worker and celebrates it. But what do we do with the people who he called the service workers? What do we do with those people? They still need to have a role in society. They need a purpose. They need to have meaning. If we don't give them that, we're going to have social turmoil and problems. And that's what we're going through right now. And it's not just in the United States, it's elsewhere.
It's global.
It's global. And we're reaping exactly what Drucker saw. And I think the solution to that is what he offered, which is we need to provide people with dignity and meaning. And we need to stop looking down on people that don't have the educational level and aren't knowledge workers. They're just as valuable. They have a place in society. They need to be listened to.
It's a very important takeaway. Another phenomenon that Peter Drucker touched upon, which again is very relevant nowadays, was the concept of burnout, without yet having the word for it. I believe he had a different description for that. So why are knowledge workers especially susceptible to burnout? Sorry, my English just left the room. And how can Peter Drucker's philosophy help organizations to mitigate this challenge?
This is one of my favorite aspects of Drucker, because right now we talk a lot about life-work balance. I just left a panel where this was like the thing everybody was discussing. And Drucker was talking about, okay, knowledge workers continue to work. A bricklayer, a roofer, somebody who does a manual job, you can only do that for so long. And then your body just gives out. Which is why we have pension funds and Social Security for people. Knowledge work, you can do, I could work into my 80s, right? As long as I have mental capacity, because it's not physical work, it's mental work. But how do you stay stimulated, and how do you stay interested in that work? And Drucker was looking at the men in his era of the mid-1900s. It was men, and he saw what we would call a midlife crisis. And he made these references to, they're turning to the bottle, and they're turning to having an affair, and he spells out exactly the kind of thing that's sort of the classic midlife crisis. And he said, those people need to have a second career, or something that they're really good at that's maybe not their career, that's a hobby. And Drucker had an example of in his own life. He would, every 3 years, study a new subject that had nothing to do with anything that he was doing at the time. So he was an expert in Japanese art and collected it and studied it to the point where he could teach it at the college level. He studied medieval history, and he did it for the mental stimulation.
Yes, so important.
And he said everybody needs to find something that they're really good at that has nothing to do with their job.
Is there one thing you're studying right now also to keep that thought alive?
I'm also a musician.
Oh, wow.
So I have a sort of an alternate life, and I'm actually a professional cellist, but I also play piano for fun.
That's wonderful.
So it's my sort of, my sanity.
It's your outlet.
Yes,
yeah.
it is.
I paint, so I understand
Oh,
you.
really?
Yes.
That's wonderful. I can't paint at all. I can't draw, but I collect art because I think I just admire people who can.
So to all of our viewers, continue nourishing whatever brings you joy and continue learning. And to everyone who wants to learn more about Peter Drucker, his thoughts, his political context, who he was as a person, but also how knowledge work is, and his thoughts on that are more relevant than ever now, get Karen's new book, Peter Drucker and Management. This has been our Book Corner interview. Karen, thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Austria and soaking up the atmosphere that Peter Drucker. Thank you so much. And with that, we close this interview. Thank you.